Hello everyone, welcome to join the trip to the universe of economics. I'm Pilot Charles, and now let's begin the journey. Hold on tight, the rocket is going to take off. Now we arrive at the universe of economics. Whoa, there are two planets right there. Let's take a closer look. Those two planets are classical planet and Keynesian planet. Let me introduce those two planets to you guys. The major difference between these two planets is the economists who live on a classical planet, they believe the market is perfect and self-sustaining, so no government interference is needed. However, the economists who live on Keynesian planet, they believe that fiscal and monetary policy is needed. So now I'm going to explain how the economy on a classical planet works. The first is equation. Classical economists believe that supply always equals to demand. And the second is automatic. They believe that the market automatically adjusts to booms and busts by itself. And the third is no governance. They believe that government's intervention can only be a detriment to the economy. And the fourth is flexibility. They believe that price and wages are flexible. Next, let's look at how the economy on Keynesian planet works. First, Keynesian economists believe that the economy is unstable. It is not self-regulating by itself, and the price and wages are sticky. So due to the unstable economy and sticky price and wages, government intervention is needed. And they also emphasize the short run. They focus on the short-run effects on the economy. After introducing these planets, now let's talk about the distinctions between these two planets. As a believer of classical school of economics, President candidate of the USA, Mitt Romney, has once said, "The invisible hand of the market always moves faster and better than the heavy hand of governments." However, in contrast, Keynes himself has once said, "In the long run, we are all dead," which means that we cannot always wait for the invisible hand of the market to work. So we can know that these two schools differ a lot. Now let's talk about these major differences in details. The first difference is about fiscal policy. Classical economists think that fiscal policy causes no long-term increase in real output, and Keynesian economists think that in recession, expansionary fiscal policy can stimulate economic activities. The second difference is about unemployment. Classical economists tend to emphasize the supply side unemployment, which is known as the natural rate of unemployment, and it cannot be changed by increasing the aggregate demand. However, because Keynesian school's shape of long-run aggregate supply curve is different from the classical schools, so they emphasize the demand-deficient unemployment, which means that the unemployment rate can be decreased by increasing the aggregate demand. The third difference is about Phillips curve. Classical economists believe that there is only a trade-off in the short term, but Keynesian economists think that there is a trade-off between the unemployment and inflation. So after comparing these different economic schools, now I'm going to explain how the differences occurs. Let's first take a look at the shape of long-run aggregate supply curve of these schools. On your left-hand side is a classical view of long-run aggregate supply curve. Classical economists think that the long-run aggregate supply curve is inelastic. It suggests that the real GDP is determined by the supply-side factors, such as the level of investment, the level of capital, and the productivity of labor, so it is always a fixed amount. Therefore, when the government tries to use fiscal policies or monetary policies to increase the aggregate demand, it will just cause inflation and will not increase the real GDP or decrease the unemployment rate. However, the Keynesian view of long-run aggregate supply curve is totally different. They think that long-run aggregate supply curve is an upward sloping curve. It is nearly flat in the beginning and become more and more vertical later, because they argue that the economy can be below full capacity in long term due to several reasons such as sticky wages, negative multiplier effect, or in a recession, people lost confidence and therefore save more by spending less. This causes a further fall in demand. Therefore, based on the graph, we can know that in certain circumstances, such as during a recession, when aggregate demand is below average, government should use fiscal policies or monetary policies to increase the aggregate demand, such as increasing the money supply to decreasing interest rate, and therefore increasing investment, or to spend more and have a budget deficit. These policies will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, and therefore increase the real GDP, decreasing unemployment rate, and solve the problem of recession. But what we can also see is that there is a rise in price level, which means that there is a trade-off between increasing real GDP and avoiding inflation. So now, after explaining the difference between those views' shape of long-run aggregate supply, let's talk about their difference in Phillips curve. This is a Phillips curve from classical view. Classical economists say that in the short term, you might be able to reduce unemployment below the natural rate by increasing aggregate demand. But in the long term, when wages adjust, unemployment will return to the natural rate and there will be a higher inflation. Therefore, there is no trade-off between unemployment and inflation. In contrast, let's take a look at Keynesian's view of Phillips curve. Keynesians argue there can be a demand-deficient unemployment, and during a recession, demand-side policies can reduce unemployment in the long term. Let's assume now we're in a recession, and we're now at point A. In Keynesian's views, if the government used fiscal policies or monetary policies to increase the aggregate demand, the equilibrium can be changed from point A to point B, which means that the unemployment rate will decrease, and in comparison, the inflation rate will increase. Therefore, there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. After explaining the differences between Keynesian schools and classical school, now let's apply these theories to the real world. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic is raging around the world. The fiscal responses to a pandemic of governments really differs a lot. Let's take Japan and Mexico as example. Japan has announced $708 billion economic stimulus package to speed up the recovery from the country's deep coronavirus-driven slump. In contrast, Mexican government has only announced a $14 billion infrastructure investment plan to repair rocky relations with business leaders and lift the struggling economy. This is a bar chart about the total amount of fiscal packages provided by different countries' governments in proportion to their GDP. As we can see that Japanese government spent a lot, but Mexican government has only spent a little. You may ask which country's policy will Keynesian economists or classical economists support? The answer is that classical economists may support Mexican government's policy, because they think that no matter how the government uses fiscal policies to increase aggregate demand, because of the long-run aggregate supply is fixed, so an increase in aggregate demand would not solve the problem of recession. Furthermore, it will make the inflation worse. Thus, for a government, doing nothing is the best choice. However, Keynesian economists may support Japanese government's policy, because they believe that such stimulus package can increase the aggregate demand in a recession, and thus increase the real GDP and decrease the unemployment rate, which will solve the problem of recession. Now I have finished my introduction to Keynesian planet and classical planet. Thank you for joining the journey to the universe of economics. Hope to see you next time. Bye bye.